In American Empire, Andrew Bacevich offers his analysis of America's foreign policy in the post-Cold War era. This talk from the Carnegie Council in New York City lasts an hour.
I've had the privilege to teach some of those students. It's great to see you here. And I also want to extend a special welcome to its director, James Chase. Thank you, James. I also want to welcome C-SPAN and the viewers who, through the magic of television, get to participate in this exchange. And finally, I don't get this floor all that often. And every time I do, I always want to thank Joanne Myers, who's the director of the Carnegie Council's Merrill House programs. Those of you who are regulars here know that she does a fabulous job, and I think this is the best forum for these kinds of discussions anywhere. So thank you, Joanne. When I think of American Empire, I have two images in mind. One of them is etched in memory. I was at an airport in China, in Beijing of all places, before they built the new airport, the dank, dusty, old Beijing airport. Stranded there with Professor Chase on our way to Shanghai. Why we didn't fly directly to Shanghai, I'll never know. But anyway, there we were waiting for our flight. When we struck up a conversation with a French businessman. I had a nice conversation and shared some noodles with him, I believe. Toward the end of the conversation, he said he had an important business call to make to the United States, and he couldn't remember the country code. At which point, James looked at him and said, 001. What else could it be? The Frenchman was not amused. But there's another side, and James of all people will appreciate what, this little story I'm about to tell, which is the other side of the arrogance of power. As a realist, he knows that there's a real danger of the arrogance of power. And this little dialogue was forwarded to me by a Canadian friend. It's a transcript of a conversation from Canadian authorities off the coast of Newfoundland in October 1995. And this was a transcript that was released by the U.S. Chief of Naval Operations. And it's in dialogue form. First, the Americans. Please divert your course 15 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. The Canadians' response. We recommend you divert your course 15 degrees to the south to avert a collision. The American response. This is the captain of a U.S. naval ship. I say again, divert your course. Canadian reply. No, I say again, divert your course. Now the Americans, and this is in bold letters with an exclamation point at the end. This is the aircraft carrier USS Missouri. We are a large warship of the U.S. Navy. Divert your course, now. Canadian response, this is a lighthouse. Your call. Well, those are the two images of the empire, and I know there's a little bit of levity in both of those stories, but especially today, and especially in wake of what's happening overseas, I think Andy Bacevich has written an extremely, extremely important book. This book was written last year, it was published last year, and we've had occasion to discuss it several times. And this is one of those books that when I read it and I heard Andy talk about it, I said, we absolutely have to have him here. And so I'm delighted that he made time out of his busy schedule to come. Andy is a professor of international relations at Boston University, and he runs their Center for International Relations. And he's a West Point graduate, has his PhD from Princeton in American diplomatic history. He writes often. You've probably seen his pieces in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, First Things. And Andy, thanks for making the time to come.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's a It's a real honor for me to have a chance to speak to this distinguished audience, and it's always fun for me to get away from Boston and come to the really big city and discuss things. I think my task is to talk for about 25 minutes or so, and I'm counting on you if I drag on to tell me to keep quiet, and I hope that after that we'll have a chance to have some discussion and get your reaction. To put it mildly, we are right now living in momentous times. And so I thought, as I was thinking about this on my way down on my very slow train, that rather than spending my 25 minutes talking directly about the book, describing the book, and trying to make a pitch to you to buy the book, although I hope you will, I thought that it might make more sense for me to offer at least one observer's reflections on what's happening now. That is to say, some reflections on the implications of the war in Iraq. And quite frankly, I'll do that in a way that does connect to my book. And in a sense, I think what I'm going to offer you in brief remarks is an addendum to the last chapter of the book. The story I tell, which is a preliminary effort to describe U.S. foreign policy in the aftermath of the Cold War, really ends with the conclusion of President Bush's first year in office. Much has happened just since that, that of course is not in my book. So let me reflect on that a little bit. Now, this is not a policy book. This is not a book that tells you what one guy thinks ought to be. Rather, this is a book that tries to offer an interpretation of what is and to invite readers to reflect on what is, because at least in my judgment, what is problematic. And the essential point of the book, and after this I'll go on to talk about the war and its implications, the essential point of the book is captured by the title, that we have, like it or not, and I don't much like it, we have, like it or not, come to preside over something like a global empire. And it is time for us as citizens to begin to face up to the implications of that very large fact. Now, it is, anytime you write a book, you invest a lot in it, not just time and effort, but, something of yourself. But I hope it is more than mere stubbornness that leads me to say that the events that have transpired since I wrote this book have only served to persuade me that my understanding of U.S. foreign policy in the aftermath of the Cold War is essentially correct. So with that as sort of the going-in position, let's discuss what's happening now. In the 1990s, I argue in this book, there was a tendency on the part of American policymakers to employ veiled language, to conceal the extent of American ambitions. To put it bluntly, the people in the policy elite were reluctant to call a spade a spade. A couple of examples of that. One that made a bit of a splash at the time, was then forgotten, but now has been revived and has been written about quite a bit lately, was the controversy surrounding the drafting of the Defense Planning Guidance of 1991. That's Bush 1 era. And that document was drafted by a guy who is very much in the news today, today's Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, who in 1991 was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the elder Bush administration. And this document, which Wolfowitz drafted, and which was leaked in draft form to the New York Times, basically said the following: we're number one. We won the Cold War. There is only one superpower. This is a circumstance which is not only agreeable, but the perpetuation of this circumstance ought to be the central thrust of U.S. foreign policy from this day onward. Well, when that hit the press in 1991, the reaction on the part of both politicians and the media was that of shock and horror that a senior U.S. official should so baldly propose the notion of orienting American grand strategy with an eye toward perpetuating American supremacy. And I dubbed this in the book the Wolfowitz indiscretion, because it taught an important lesson to others in the Bush administration and to members of the Clinton administration that followed, and that was, we don't say these things out loud. It is unseemly to talk about the United States trying to perpetuate its supremacy. The second example that I offer in the book is what I called Albright's rule. And Albright's rule was the creation of Madeleine Albright during her time as Secretary of State. You may recall the very famous incident. It was one of the times when we were gearing up to pummel Saddam Hussein in the ineffective way that we did during the Clinton administration. And Albright and Sandy Berger and William Cohen went to Ohio State University to make an appearance before students, and basically the purpose of the appearance was to, quote unquote, make the case for war. But Madeleine Albright didn't want to call it war. The student reaction was very negative, and the Clinton people were getting heckled. And at one time, Madeleine Albright sort of spit out, "We're not talking about war, we're talking about the use of force." And this was very much part of the 1990s. We didn't like to talk about war. You may recall the Kosovo War of 1999, which was a 77-day bombing campaign, which the Clinton administration never called a war. Albright's rule said we weren't supposed to do such things. Well, point number one that I would make with regard to the current circumstances is that both the Wolfowitz indiscretion and the Albright's rule, both of them have been repealed. And now, for better or worse, and it may actually be for better, we've begun to say out loud what our intentions genuinely are. And in that regard, there's nothing more important, and you all should read, perhaps already have, the Bush administration's national security strategy, which was published last September, available on the White House website, a document that makes quite explicit our intention to maintain our global dominance. Wolfowitz's view is back. It now has the imprimatur of the President of the United States. And of course, the whole notion of we don't do war has also gone by the board. We do make war. Of course, now we marry that to the language of liberation, so that our wars, of course, are virtuous. Indeed, when I wrote this book, and my publisher, Harvard University Press, quite frankly, persuaded me to call it American Empire, it was with the thought that that's going to be a catchy title. That's going to irritate people. It is remarkable. To me, it's remarkable. The extent to which words like empire, imperium, phrases like pax Americana have now insinuated themselves into public discourse and are no longer controversial. So the veil has dropped since 9/11. We see it in the war that's going on right now. And I think that's a very important recent development that I would add on to that last chapter were I to expand it. Point number two. Point number two has to do with the militarization of U.S. foreign policy, which I would cite as a major theme of American empire. It is remarkable. It was remarkable to me, at least, the extent to which the United States came out of the Cold War into an era in which we no longer faced a major threat, and that the response to that with regard to the use of force was a far greater willingness to use force. And who paved the way in that tendency? Well, the guy who paved the way in that tendency was the individual whom one active duty U.S. Air Force general officer referred to as that dope-smoking, skirt-chasing, draft-dodging fella who was in the White House in the 1990s. Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton led the way in removing the barriers with regard to the use of force. And it's not just the use of force, of course, it's the level of U.S. defense spending. Fareed Zakaria had a piece called The Arrogant Empire, cover story in Newsweek, 2 or 3 weeks ago? And just glancing through that, I noticed, at least by his calculation, I haven't checked his arithmetic, by his calculation, the United States spends more on military spending than every other nation in the world combined. I do believe that is historically unprecedented, but that's not really the surprising bit. The surprising bit is that, for those of us who are Americans, that fact is utterly uncontroversial. Of course. Of course. So, in the aftermath of the Cold War, the use of force, the maintenance of force, the perpetuation of American military supremacy have come to be very important themes, and of course, recent events have simply reinforced that and reaffirmed that. Again, I refer you back to the Bush administration's national security strategy, which strikingly promulgates a doctrine of preventive war and warns explicitly against any other nation thinking that it can exercise a similar prerogative. And it's not just talk, of course, it's action. Because the war against Iraq is a preventive war. It is a war of choice. It is not a war that is forced upon us. It is a war that we have chosen to undertake. So the militarization of American foreign policy continues in the period following the period covered by my book. So much so that I at least am convinced all the more so that what I said in the book is correct. And that is that the exercise of military power has become the preferred instrument of American national power. The third point. The third point has to do with the exercise of American global leadership. And you can almost put that phrase in quotes. That is one euphemism that survives. I argue in the book that one expression of American global leadership has been a determination that the United States will maintain a dominant position, let us use the political sciencey term hegemony, in any region of the world that the United States views as strategically significant. Now, it's not that this is some recent development. I mean, during the course of the 19th century, the United States determined that having a dominant position in the Western Hemisphere was essential to our well-being and security. And by the time 1898 rolls around, we had secured that, and we have maintained that ever since. In the aftermath of World War II, this bloody mess, the United States had decided that a dominant position in Western Europe and a dominant position in East Asia were also essential to our well-being. And we devoted a tremendous amount of attention, energy, resources, to include a couple of East Asian wars, in an effort to maintain those positions as we have down to the present day. Again, it's among those facts that as Americans we so take for granted that we don't even notice them. More than a half century after the end of World War II, when, I would argue, no security threat exists that threatens the well-being of Western Europe, we still maintain 100,000 troops there. And we don't even think about it. Well, the end of the Cold War focused attention on yet another region, and that was the Persian Gulf. And in the Persian Gulf War of 1991, the elder President Bush thought that he had secured American hegemony in that strategically important region. But it turned out during the course of the 1990s that our hold in the Persian Gulf was quite uncertain. We miscalculated about the impact of the first Persian Gulf War, and it turned out that Saddam Hussein had survived. It turned out that maintaining a troop presence in the Persian Gulf on a somewhat smaller scale than we did in Asia and in Europe did not have the same stabilizing effects. On the contrary, it had a destabilizing effect, as the attacks on Khobar Towers, on the American embassies in Africa, on the USS Cole suggested. That is to say, the U.S. presence created a backlash. All of which ended up setting the stage, of course, for the present war. And the removal of Saddam Hussein, and I would suggest to you in all likelihood, the conversion of Iraq into not simply a bastion of pro-American sentiment, but a new base for operating American military power, intended to secure hegemony for good now in the Persian Gulf. And, oh, by the way, we would say parenthetically, since the end of the Cold War, the United States has also established at least a foothold in yet another region, Central Asia. Now, will that result in an effort to maintain hegemony there? Hard to say, but a development that we really ought to continue to watch. Fourth point, I think. I talk a lot in this book about what I call a strategy of openness, really an effort to inculcate norms favorable to us, our norms, our values, as a prerequisite for security, American security, and American, and indeed global prosperity. Up to 9/11, the Arab world was given a waiver on this notion of adhering to American norms. I mean, you know the basic relationship between ourselves and the Arab nations, particularly the Arab nations of the Persian Gulf. They got security. We guaranteed it. We got oil. We, not simply the United States, but the developed world. And we both got stability. In the course of that, of course, Arab notions of governance pretty much got ignored. No longer. No longer. Because the current war really doesn't end in Baghdad, does it? Baghdad is really the first phase in a larger effort, which the Bush administration is now clearly signaling, intended to fix a problematic part of the world through modernization, liberalization, and openness. Let me borrow the book just for a second.
Sure, yeah.
I'll give you, this is your dramatic reading. When I'm talking about this strategy of openness, and I talk about how it didn't apply to the Middle East. After 1991, U.S. troops garrisoned the Persian Gulf not to pry the region open to American enterprise and American values, but to prop up the status quo, but only temporarily. In due course, the opportunity to open the Arab world would present itself. For if, as members of the American policy elite insisted with near unanimity, and I had been citing these members of the policy elite, if, as they insisted with near unanimity, democracy, market principles, and globalization were indeed sweeping the world, then existing regimes in key states like Egypt and Saudi Arabia were living on borrowed time. When it became expedient to do so, and I would insert parenthetically, it has become expedient to do so. When it became expedient to do so, senior U.S. officials could be expected to unveil all the truths that the White House and the State Department had for many years chosen to soft pedal or ignore that these regimes were deeply corrupt, denied civil liberties, engaged in wholesale violations of human rights, and resolutely opposed anything even remotely resembling popular rule. That is what we know places like Saudi Arabia and Egypt to be. When they went, few members of the American foreign policy establishment would lament their demise. Virtually all would applaud the opening of the region to democratic capitalism that would presumably ensue. And I would tell you that the words that I wrote back in about the year 2000 are now coming to pass, and we will hear much about the need of the Saudis and the Egyptians to be more cognizant of human rights and the like. And they ought to be. Fifth point. I'm not as cynical as you may think me to be based on these remarks. I'm actually a pretty idealistic fellow. But I argue in this book, and I think it is true, and I think we're seeing the truth today, that when it comes to American statecraft, despite all our talk about American idealism, ideals really matter only when they coincide with U.S. interests. And indeed, I argue in the book that in the 1990s, in most of the military interventions undertaken on Bill Clinton's watch that were justified, of course, as humanitarian interventions, Bosnia, Kosovo, Haiti, were in fact driven and shaped by considerations of self-interest. And I would say today, on the first day of the liberation of Baghdad and the liberation of the Iraqi people, and that liberation is real, and it should be applauded by any decent human being, that has occurred not because of our concern for the Iraqi people, but it occurred because of American strategic, economic, and political self-interest. That is to say, liberation is real, but it's a byproduct. The war to bring down Saddam Hussein is no more motivated by a desire to free the Iraqi people than the war to bring down Hitler was motivated by a determination to free those in the death camps. We may wish that that's why we fought that war in World War II. We may wish that the reason we're doing what we're doing in Iraq is to free oppressed people, but it's simply not the case. That is to say, don't expect to see Operation Burmese Freedom happen anytime soon. The people of Burma deserve to be freed, and quite frankly, if one would take seriously the idealistic rhetoric of that Bush administration national security strategy, then we ought to be sending our aircraft carriers to Burma next. Nor will there be any effort to liberate the people of Zimbabwe, to free them from the yoke of oppression of Robert Mugabe. Nor are we likely to see any regime change anytime soon in Havana. And my point of saying all this is simply that let us celebrate the achievement of American men and women in uniform and the extraordinary military campaign that they have fought. Let us celebrate the fact that the people of Iraq are indeed free today of a tyrant, and we wish them well. But let's not allow ourselves to become intoxicated on the vapors of the idealistic rhetoric that we spout in order to find an idealistic rationale for doing something that we actually do for quite other reasons. One last point, if I may.
One more, sure.
About three minutes. And I don't write about this in the book. At least I don't think I do. The events going on today, now, in this time, I think affirm this important fact, that we will never again be a normal nation. There are a lot of people here roughly my age and some a little bit older, meaning you are of the Cold War. When I was a kid, growing up in the 1950s, and even in the 1960s, understanding in some vague way that this thing called the Cold War, this danger called communism, this ominous threat called the Soviet Union, needed to be addressed, needed to be confronted. For some vague reason, I don't know why, there was this little notion in the back of my mind that even though I had no conception of when these problems would go away, that when they went away, whenever that was, that the United States would once again become a normal nation. I didn't even know what normal meant, but I knew that, I thought I knew, that the exertions of the Cold War were out of the ordinary, and we'd revert to some sort of status quo. I was thinking on the way down, when I was a kid in the 1950s, what would the word Baghdad have meant to me? It would have meant Arabian Nights. It would have meant flying carpets. It would have meant something so exotic that it would be utterly alien, the stuff for Disney cartoons. Baghdad. When I was a kid in the 50s, what would I have thought of the word Afghanistan, which clearly I would not have been able to identify on a map? I think in the 1950s, Afghanistan would have been, for me, in the same category of, as a name place, Siberia, Mongolia, distant, desolate, far, far away from anything that would have to do with me. Now think about it today, all right? We know, because we've been living through these events, we know how things came to be in a sense that we know what happened yesterday and the day before and the day before, and so we know why we're in Afghanistan, we know why we're in Baghdad. But think about it. American soldiers invading Baghdad to stay for how long? American soldiers fighting in Afghanistan, a place that, if it has any meaning at all, is a place where empires clash. Now, again, in a sense, we know how we got here. But I would say if you step back from it a little bit, at least if you're of my generation, and think about it, you really cannot help but be astonished. And quite frankly, you cannot reach any conclusion about what's going on other than the fact that we are the new Rome. We do preside over a global empire. We do have a militarized foreign policy, and there probably is no escape. So I thank you very much, and I look forward to entertaining your comments.
Great. Well, thank you, Andy. As you can see, this isn't just a book of research and analysis, but Andy put a lot of himself into it. And we really appreciate you sharing that with us and your thoughts. I'm going to go directly to questions now. I'm going to ask you to please raise your hand, identify yourself, and then please wait for the microphone to arrive before you start your questions. And we've got about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll have our reception. Okay, thanks. Gentleman here.
Take it right here.
Oh, I'm sorry, there's a gentleman here, and then we'll come over here. Yes, thank you, Arlen. Yes.
Arlen Lesson. If your analysis is correct, and it certainly is logical, then the self-interest of the United States would seem to be on a hegemonic basis also relative to Iran and perhaps other countries which aren't in the same category as Cuba or Zimbabwe. Do you foresee United States interests being sufficient to cause us to enter into our own interest of military efforts in those countries?
This is what I think is going on right now. This administration is deeply divided in many respects. If we could call it, it's unfair, it's too simplified, but let us call the two camps the Powell camp and the Wolfowitz camp. We'll call it the Wolfowitz camp despite the fact that he's number 2 in defense, but in recognition of the fact that he seems to be intellectually the driving force of what I would label the imperialists. Powell much more cautionary in his views, or cautious. Powell lost this round, clearly. Powell's a good soldier. Powell continued to serve his president. But having lost the first round doesn't mean that all subsequent rounds are lost. My sense is that the imperialists wanted to go get Saddam for a whole variety of reasons, but ultimately because the imperialist strategy, the strategy of cementing American hegemony in the Persian Gulf, pursued not for any sort of sordid, cynical reasons like oil in particular. Yes, oil always figures. But pursued because they are determined to ensure that 9/11 doesn't happen again. And for people in the imperial camp, the two big numbers to emerge from 7/11 are what? 15 and 19. 15 and 19. There were 19 hijackers, 15 of them came from Saudi Arabia. That is to say, the key fact is conditions in that part of the world breed people who hate the United States of America and are willing to die in order to kill us. And so the strategy aims to bring about the transformation of this region, to remove these conditions, again, to open it up, to inculcate our norms so that terror won't come from there. Iraq is step number 1. Wolfowitz, for example, has said, others have said, it's common now. We intend to make Iraq the first functioning Arab democracy. And I think there is consensus in the administration on that score. Where there is not consensus is, how do we get to step 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6? Because those do require opening up Saudi Arabia, opening up Egypt, opening up Syria, opening up Iran. And the methods that are employed are going to be dependent upon the particular case. Certainly the hope would be, the most optimistic scenario is that when the people of other Arab nations and those of Iran see that Iraq prospers, Iraq is democratic, Iraq is free, that will encourage liberal tendencies from the bottom up in these other societies. And that those liberal tendencies will force repressive leaders to adapt change. That's a nice thought. I am not optimistic. The pessimistic scenario is one that says that the leadership resists the requirement to change. Perhaps the leadership crushes the forces that are advocating change from within, which, of course, would provide an opportunity to do what? To declare our solidarity with the people of fill in the blank and to use our superior military power. I'm actually working on an op-ed. I don't know if I'm going to get it done. And the op-ed is Operation, parentheses, insert name here, parentheses closed, freedom. Because I think that's what we're engaged in.
That's good. There's another gentleman here. Yes.
Michael Volchak, Volchak Consulting. At the beginning of your talk, you talked about what has led to the increasing use of force since the end of the Cold War, and you laid most of it at the door of the Clinton administration. And I wonder what you think about the first Persian Gulf War being a major reason that has led to the increased use of force. Obviously, it sort of demonstrated much lower costs of us using our military.
Right. You are correct. And indeed in the book, I did just say that, and it's a major theme of the book, but this tries to tell the story of U.S. foreign policy basically from 1990 to the year 2001. And yes, I try to give due credit, if that's what it is, to the elder Bush, who, of course, launched us in, what was the first long now forgotten episode of the post-Cold War era? Panama. Somebody didn't forget, all right? Very interesting reassertion of American dominance in this hemisphere, sort of a reminder, all right? But yes, that was then followed by the Persian Gulf War, and certainly what seemed to be the enormous success of Desert Storm, and I phrase it that way for a reason, encouraged tendencies, to include tendencies on the left, to now believe that force had become much more useful. I mean, Bush, the elder, was certainly correct in arguing that now we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome as a result of that. Now, I say seemed like a great victory because, of course, in retrospect, I think observers would argue that Desert Storm was a deeply flawed victory that has probably led us down a path that got us where we are today, and it's been a bloody path and may well be a bloodier one still.
Yeah, Steve? Can you reach him? No? I'm sorry. Steve, can you just shout? Okay. Oh, he's coming the other side.
You have to stand one side.
Steve Handelman, Time Magazine. It's hard to argue with the facts that you've laid out, which suggest the birth or the renewal, perhaps, of the American empire. But what makes me a little bit skeptical is that it ignores some of the changes that have happened since the Cold War ended in other parts of the world, which suggest that not everybody, particularly our interlocutors, are as likely to submit to our definition of an empire as they might have been maybe 100 years ago with Britain or others. And added to that is the real question of whether this concept of an American empire in the Bush administration, Bush II, and as you said, it began perhaps with Clinton, raises the question, would it last past the current the current Bush administration? So how deep is this really, and how much can it survive the number of other organizations and coalitions that are out there in the world?
I mean, it is certainly a major theme of my book, which you'll have to read it to either be persuaded or not, is to argue that there's far more continuity than discontinuity between administrations. That, to pick on Time Magazine, you guys, for all kinds of good reasons, want to see difference. You want to argue difference and discontinuity. And it's not that that's not legitimate, and it's not that that's not illuminating to a degree. But my argument is that that doesn't really tell the story. The real story of U.S. foreign policy comes in seeing the extent to which liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats, by and large, think alike, talk alike, and act alike. Again, you'd have to sort of take stock of it yourself. Opposition, yes, indeed. I mean, one of the reasons that, for me, it's important to say, we're an empire. Face up to it, because it ain't going to come for free. I mean, gracious sakes, we see that in the events that are now unfolding. And you are certainly correct in my judgment that the way we wield our power, if it is done in a way that comes across as arrogant, if it comes across in a way that does not take into account the concerns and needs of those groups we view as part of our empire, the result's going to be to increase the likelihood of opposition. And certainly that's the problem with old Europe today. I mean, one could argue, I would argue that in the first of all, back up, how is it that we became the hegemon in Western Europe. How did we come to be the nation that says we are the leading European power? We're not even in Europe. That came about as a result of World War II, but it came about in the aftermath of World War II because the Europeans wanted it. Somebody's written a book called Empire by Invitation. The French wanted us. The Brits wanted us. The Germans wanted us. And they wanted us there. They wanted us to be the guarantor of their security. And the American empire in Europe produced what? It certainly strongly contributed to the emergence of a Europe today is peaceful and is affluent and is democratic. And all that's good. We get to the end of the Cold War. And I think that even in Paris, European statesmen said to themselves, their calculus was, well, okay, there's only one superpower left. What kind of world's that going to be? I think they concluded that it was a world that they could live with. An expectation that at least be able to nudge the Americans or perhaps restrain the Americans from time to time, and that Americans basically shared their views and were sensible people, and that a world in which America was the sole superpower would be a world good for Europe too. And I think that the events since 9/11 have now called that into question. It hasn't made them change their mind, but what they see now is a nation which, again, has committed itself to a doctrine of preventive war. And I truly believe that President Bush is genuinely persuaded that that doctrine is in the interest of the United States of America. I also think it scares the bejesus out of the Europeans. And we now have shown that with regard to the United Nations Security Council, and I am no apologist for the United Nations at all, but with regard to the United Nations Security Council, we don't care what they say. When we see a requirement to use force in a major way, we're going to do it. So I think people like Chirac face a huge problem. Now, there are those who argue that the European response is going to be, given their affluence, given the size of the population, that we'll see the emergence of a counterweight. I'm skeptical about that. I'm skeptical because they haven't figured out what language their army is going to speak. They manifestly do not have the will to spend sufficient money on defense to create any kind of a counterweight. And quite frankly, they're not even procreating at a sufficient rate to have enough young people to be in an army. So huge dilemmas, given the kind of society they have become, but they are deeply frightened, and I think trying to figure out whether or not they are willing to live in a world in which there is one superpower that basically calls the shots.
Okay, we're running up against time, but we did start late, so I'm going to keep going for just a little bit more. That's all right. Sure. And those of you who have to leave, we understand, but we're just going to go a few more minutes. Christian?
Yeah. You said that you were, in fact, a bit of an idealist, so I'm going to ask you to indulge your idealism, since most of the account you gave was at least a descriptive, realist account of what's going on. And namely, what keeps you from being a prescriptive realist? That is, do you see a just and also politically feasible alternative to this hegemonic picture? And what might that look like? Because then we might not be so quick to applaud, much as we may be happy for the Iraqis, this war, which many seem to think really represents the effective elimination of any kind of cosmopolitan alternative to a hegemonic governance of the world.
So the question is, why am I not prescriptive?
Yeah.
And the answer is because I can't figure out the answer. I mean, let me tell you, I'm an idealist in this sense. I'm an idealist in the sense that I believe in this republic. I love America. I am enamored with the vision of the founders of this republic who set out to create something that was new and special. And some of what was going to be special about America was that this would be a place in which war and military power and power politics and dominion, all those things that were like plagues in the old world, they wouldn't be here in the new world. And I'm an idealist in the sense that it makes me very sad that as a people we have lost sight of that, and we are becoming something that, at least in my judgment, there are people who vehemently reject this view. We have become something that I think would appall the founders. Having said that, I have no idea how, having mounted this tiger, we can now simply say, let's get off. So although my heart says, I wish that we could not be an imperial power, my head says, I think we're stuck with it. And being stuck with it means that we have to try to address some difficult questions, and not to let the people in Washington tell us what the answers to those questions are, but as citizens to engage these things. For example, I was a serving officer for 23 years. I don't know what you think of the American military today. It's obviously immensely capable. There's nothing like it. It's also a professional military. It is a military which is increasingly detached from the American people. And quite frankly, we like that. We'll send these guys over there and these gals, and we'll applaud them, but we don't get our hands dirty. Well, this is a remarkable abandonment of a tradition of citizen soldiering that was part of who we were. Is it a good thing to have a professional army? Maybe it's necessary if you're going to govern an empire. On the other hand, we once thought that a standing army was a threat to liberty. Could that be the case now? Are you confident that it's not? Would it surprise you to know that the officer corps is now significantly politicized and defines itself as conservative and votes Republican? Is that good or is that bad? I'm a conservative, but I don't think it's good that an officer corps has a political point of view. So these are things we need to think about, it seems to me. How can we assure that the American policy has to somehow take moral considerations into account? And quite frankly, self-interest says that when you govern an empire, you have to take moral considerations into account, or the natives get restless. How do we do that, given our reluctance to spend our resources for purposes of development? That's a very clear part of who we are as a people today. Defense budget's up near $400 billion a year, but if somebody says, let's actually spend money to fix the problems of the world, it's, oh no, that's a black hole, that's foreign aid, that's a waste. We need to revisit those things, I think.
Well, on the point of realism and idealism, I just want to give the floor to James Chase, we've had about a 10-year conversation on this very topic as idealists but realists. Can you help us out, James?
No, I have a question for Andy Bacevich, because I'm very much in agreement with you. The empire is here to stay, like it or not. I mean, we have to therefore deal with the reality. This is the reality. If that's so, I want to push you a little further, if I may, on internationalism and on relationships with traditional allies. In the past, as you know, we've had arguments with the Allies, but remember the Pershing missiles, and everybody's, there was a big problem there and various things. But it's always been sort of patched over one another. They're always strains, after all. I'm wondering if this isn't different. This is not a question of a strain. It doesn't mean that Tony Blair may think he's going to be a bridge, but I don't think he's going to be a bridge to anything. So I asked that question, how far do you think this is going to go? Do you think there is a way back?
Well, I hope there is, and I don't know if Tony Blair is a bridge, but it does seem to me that that's the crucial relationship. We were talking about this with some of my students this past week, and you are all the more impressed that the special relationship with Great Britain is something that is vital to us. And therefore, if Tony Blair comes and says, I need help on making this occupation look like a UN operation, or something of that notion, it seems to me that it is very much in our interest to be forthcoming, because I do fear that the breakdown could be irretrievable with Europe. The only reason I would say I'm not certain there's a breakdown is because I think Europe's choices from Europe's perspective are lousy. I mean, again, if they're not part of the empire, albeit, a willing part, then what are they? And how much is it going to cost them? And are they willing to give up, 6-week-long vacations in Morocco in order to pay the cost of creating a European power?
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Andy. I appreciate your comments. Thank you all.
Andrew Bacevich is author of American Empire: The Realities and Consequences of U.S. Diplomacy. It's published by Harvard University Press. On the web at hup.harvard.edu.
Is problematic. And the essential point of the book, and after this I'll go on to talk about the war and its implications, the essential point of the book is captured by the title, that we have, like it or not, and I don't much like it, we have, like it or not, come to preside over something like a global empire. And it is time for us as citizens to begin to face up to the implications of that very large fact. Now, it is, anytime you write a book, you invest a lot in it, not just time and effort, but, something of yourself. But I hope it is more than mere stubbornness that leads me to say that the events that have transpired since I wrote this book have only served to persuade me that my understanding of U.S. foreign policy in the aftermath of the Cold War is essentially correct. So with that as sort of the going-in position, let's discuss what's happening now. In the 1990s, I argue in this book, there was a tendency on the part of American policymakers to employ veiled language to conceal the extent of American ambitions. To put it bluntly, the people in the policy elite were reluctant to call a spade a spade. A couple of examples of that. One that made a bit of a splash at the time, was then forgotten, but now has been revived and has been written about.
Shanghai. Why we didn't fly directly to Shanghai, I'll never know. But anyway, there we were waiting for our flight. When we struck up a conversation with a French businessman. I had a nice conversation and shared some noodles with him, I believe. Toward the end of the conversation, he said he had an important business call to make to the United States, and he couldn't remember the country code. At which point, James looked at him and said, 001. What else could it be? The Frenchman was not amused. But there's another side, and James of all people will appreciate what, this little story I'm about to tell, which is the other side of the arrogance of power. As a realist, he knows that there's a real danger of the arrogance of power. And this little dialogue was forwarded to me by a Canadian friend. It's a transcript of a conversation from Canadian authorities off the coast of Newfoundland in October 1995. And this was a transcript that was released by the U.S. Chief of Naval Operations. And it's in dialogue form. First, the Americans. Please divert your course 15 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. The Canadians' response. We recommend you divert your course 15 degrees to the south to avert a collision. The American response. This is the captain of a U.S. naval ship. I say again, divert your course. Canadian reply, no, I say again, divert your course. Now the Americans, and this is in bold letters.
That after that, we'll have a chance to have some discussion and get your reaction. To put it mildly, we are right now living in momentous times. And so I thought, as I was thinking about this on my way down on my very slow train, that rather than spending my 25 minutes talking directly about the book, describing the book, and trying to make a pitch to you to buy the book, although I hope you will, I thought that it might make more sense for me to offer at least one observer's reflections on what's happening now. That is to say, some reflections on the implications of the war in Iraq. And quite frankly, I'll do that in a way that does connect to my book. And in a sense, I think what I'm going to offer you in brief remarks is an addendum to the last chapter of the book. The story I tell, which is a preliminary effort to describe U.S. foreign policy in the aftermath of the Cold War, really ends with the conclusion of President Bush's first year in office. Much has happened just since that, that of course is not in my book. So let me reflect on that a little bit. Now, this is not a policy book. This is not a book that tells you what one guy thinks ought to be. Rather, this is a book that tries to offer an interpretation of what is and to invite readers to reflect on what is, because at least in my judgment, what is
with an exclamation point at the end. This is the aircraft carrier USS Missouri. We are a large warship of the U.S. Navy. Divert your course, now. The Canadian response, this is a lighthouse. Your call. Well, those are the two images of the empire, and I know there's a little bit of levity in both of those stories, but especially today, and especially in wake of what's happening overseas, I think Andy Bacevich has written an extremely, extremely important book. This book was written last year, it was published last year, and we've had occasion to discuss it several times. And this is one of those books that when I read it and I heard Andy talk about it, I said, we absolutely have to have him here. And so I'm delighted that he made time out of his busy schedule to come. Andy is professor of international relations at Boston University, and he runs their Center for International Relations. And he's a West Point graduate, has his PhD from Princeton in American diplomatic history. He writes often. You've probably seen his pieces in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, First Things. And Andy, thanks for making the time to come.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's a real honor for me to have a chance to speak to this distinguished audience, and it's always fun for me to get away from Boston and come to the really big city and discuss things. I think my task is to talk for about 25 minutes or so, and I'm counting on you if I drag on to tell me to keep quiet, and I hope.
In American Empire, Andrew Bacevich offers his analysis of America's foreign policy in the post-Cold War era. This talk from the Carnegie Council in New York City lasts an hour.
I've had the privilege to teach some of those students. It's great to see you here. And I also want to extend a special welcome to its director, James Chase. Thank you, James. I also want to welcome C-SPAN and the viewers who, through the magic of television, get to participate in this exchange. And finally, I don't get this floor all that often, And every time I do, I always want to thank Joanne Myers, who's the director of the Carnegie Council's Merrill House programs. Those of you who are regulars here know that she does a fabulous job, and I think this is the best forum for these kinds of discussions anywhere. So thank you, Joanne. When I think of American empire, I have two images in mind. One of them is etched in memory. I was at an airport in China, in Beijing of all places, before they built the new airport, the dank, dusty, old Beijing airport, stranded there with Professor Chase on our way to